This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Today's edition of the Paul McGuire Report is extremely important. It concerns your freedoms now and in the future, whether you live in the United States of America, Europe, or whatever nation you happen to live in. Let's just put it this way. All across planet Earth, freedom is under attack. And it's not a mystical reason why freedom is under attack. It's really, the explanation is incredibly simple why freedom is under attack. Despite what you have been told by the mass media, the mainstream media, despite what you have been told in the educational system and so on and so forth, in whatever nation you live in, there is a basic reality that you have to come to terms with. You have to understand in order for you to really understand the reality that you live in. Because unless you have this foundational grid, and you got to not just know a little about it, you have to know enough about it where you own the truth, not just, do a drive-by through this type of truth. And here's the basic scenario that you have to have fixed in your mind. If you don't have it fixed in your mind, then you're going to be incapable of processing the thinking that's necessary in which to see the real reality. Real reality versus the artificial illusion of reality that is attempting to seduce you through technology and other means. This artificial reality is really, it's an invisible concentration camp of the mind. That's exactly what it is. But it doesn't appear to be a concentration camp of the mind. It appears to be almost like paradise. So a Christian, a true biblical Christian, versus what your average evangelical Christian is, are two different things. I'm not trying to put down every evangelical Christian. There are many exceptions to what I'm saying, both as pastors, as some denominations, and churches. I understand that. But they are in the minority percentage. You're talking about, 30%, and I'm being generous, that are owners of the truth, not people who just drive by through the truth. So the basic question is this. If we take the Bible seriously, and then, of course, if we don't take the Bible seriously, well, that's our big mistake. But the Bible tells us very clearly that after Adam and Eve rejected the truth, notice there's always a cost for rejecting the truth. And the truth is always incorporated with God's word. When Adam and Eve rejected the truth in the Garden of Eden and allowed themselves to be seduced by the lies of Lucifer, they activated the law of sin and death. They lost their God-given rulership and authority and power to rule and reign over planet Earth. And they allowed the death force to enter their bodies in the human race. And this has continued genetically as the DNA of Adam and Eve continues to be passed on right up until our generation, because each one of us were born with the fallen nature of Adam and Eve. It was only until we accepted Jesus Christ that we became new creatures in Jesus Christ. But that truth is not finalized until Christ either comes and raptures us, or until we die here on earth. And the moment we die, we are absent from the body and present with the Lord, and we receive instantaneously our new glorified bodies in the kingdom of heaven at a perfect age, perfect health, and so on. So here is the basic foundational truth that you have to understand. And when you're talking to people, unless they understand this basic foundational truth, they cannot escape the seduction and the power of spiritual deception and the power of illusion which in a metaphorical sense I call, and others have called, the Matrix. That's right, why I wrote my book, Conquering the Matrix. It's a biblical book. I simply chose to use I deliberately chose to use the language of science fiction to communicate a biblical truth because I'm trying to reach a wider audience than just Christians. So thus the title, Conquering the Matrix. Now, to show you exactly what I mean by how there are invisible forces, powerful forces, that are trying to hijack your reality and place you into a kind of virtual reality, virtual world, and how they do that through the manipulation of your mind, your perceptions, and your views on reality. And they can take anything and they can distort it and they can rework it until you can program a population to believe just about anything, even if it's completely fictional. God, in his word, from Genesis to Revelation, repeats constantly the power of truth, the power of truthful prophecy, the power of a truthful prophet, the power of truthful teaching, the power of simply telling the truth, living the truth, theological truth. Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. There is power, enormous power in truth. A lie always has its origins in Satan or Lucifer because Satan is the father of lies. So any political system, any psychological system, any system of government, law, any human system on earth, whether it's a sexual system, and by sexual system I mean sexual beliefs and practices adhered to by a percentage of the culture, whether those sexual precepts, if you will, regarding marriage, family, sexual practices, or whatever, they're either based on truth or they're based on lies. If they're based on lies, they will inevitably lead individuals into destruction through a variety of means. If they're based on truth, then there's the very real possibility of fruitfulness and prosperity and blessing because things are being done according to the truth, which is God's plan. Now, this program is going to set a lot of people free on a lot of levels. So I would suggest very strongly to you that you pray throughout the program and ask the Lord, who does he want you to send this program to? And then go to paulmcguire.us. You can use any number of social technologies that we have for you listed on paulmcguire.us, and you can send them a free link of this program. And it would be helpful if you would kind of introduce the program in your own words and tell the people you're communicating with, like, why they should listen to it, because your introduction and your sphere of influence probably means a lot more than you think it does. And that's how we spread the word. Now, it's interesting. We now have the norm. We all accept it as the norm. Surveillance technology is everywhere. In fact, I don't care what anybody tells you officially. There's been enough whistleblowers and just common sense analysis of the technology. Everybody should know that you're being under constant surveillance, despite what anyone tells you. I mean, really wake up and smell the coffee. You're under 24/7 constant surveillance. That doesn't mean you're necessarily, quote, a person of interest, a term that fictional TV series love to make popular. It doesn't mean you've necessarily done anything wrong. It simply means you're under surveillance, so that if in the event in the future you were to do something wrong, they can retrieve your past electronically, because all of your past is electronically recorded and stored in gigantic computers located in different regions around the world and the nation. So let's say you've never committed a crime. You've been perfectly innocent. But let's say 10 years from now, you commit some crime of some nature. Well, because they have all of your information, pictures, video, sound, all kinds of stuff that you don't know about, they can go back in time and see who your friends were, your contacts were, what your psychological motivations were, and they can piece together your motivation for committing a crime, and they can prove, let's hope they can prove, they don't fictionalize it, but they can theoretically prove that you were involved in the crime because, for example, they can go back in time and access security cameras that were recording everybody in a hallway you were walking down in or whatever. Or only God knows if, I mean, we know this for a fact, that in your house, you're under constant surveillance. It doesn't matter what they say. You know, I learned this in the film industry, working with actors and directors and screenwriters. And the old expression always was the same. When you're talking about a character in a movie or a TV show or whatever, a character's intent, a character's motivation, whether a character is good or evil, is never determined by what the character says about themselves, male or female. What a person really is always determined by behavior. So this really is something we should apply in life because it synchronizes with what Jesus Christ said. Jesus Christ said, "You shall know a tree by its fruit." In other words, you'll know a person by his or her fruit. If it's bearing good spiritual fruit, then it's a good person, a good tree, if you will. And the same with other things in life. Going back to Hollywood and screenplay writers and such, you know, only in the worst written films would a character ever say, "Oh, I'm evil," or "I'm good." That would be lame beyond belief. It's their behavior and the greater the craft of the screenwriter, the more subtly he or she introduces the behavior which reveals the character of the person they've written about. So, you know, it'll be very subtle things that are presented to you that may not mean anything initially, but when you go back and piece it together, you'll go, aha, those were the clues that this person really was evil or devious or whatever. So a character in Hollywood is always determined by his or her actions, not by their words. Only like a really pathetic screenplay writer would have a character reveal who or she is by their word, by their words. It should be revealed by the subtleties and the choices of what they choose to do and what they choose not to do, et cetera, et cetera. So when we have people in our government who come before congressional hearings and say that the American people are not under surveillance 24/7, well, the problem with that is that that contradicts the testimony of whistleblowers that have said repeatedly that we are all under surveillance 24/7. So I don't believe somebody just because they say such and such. You've got to judge them by their actions. So let's start from a more realistic assumption, an assumption based on the testimonies of numerous whistleblowers and the very fact, a fact. We should base our perception on a fact. The fact is, it is a slam dunk. It is very simple for us to employ technology in which every person is under surveillance 24/7. It's just like the movie with Tom Cruise, Minority Report. And if you haven't seen it in the movie, you can be arrested for what they call pre-crime. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but the concept of the film is that it's the future, you know, like a Blade Runner type future. And they're constantly analyzing people. And it gets a little bit occultic, but it's not really a movie about the occults, where they have these like genetically modified beings that just are submerged in like a sensory deprivation tank, and they have this almost psychic ability to predict the future, and they're interfacing with computer technology. And so since they monitor every aspect of an individual's life, computers are constantly recording and sifting and evaluating. And if the computers, the artificial intelligence, along with these genetically created beings, if the artificial intelligence determines through computer calculations that you are going to commit a crime in the future, let's say a murder or something, then the police come to you before you actually commit the crime, and they arrest you and they imprison you. And sometimes they do it like 30 seconds or 60 seconds before you commit the crime. The movie is making the assumption most of the time that the computers are accurate, but the movie also shows that the computers can be completely mistaken, and as such, innocent people get arrested for a computer analysis based on artificial intelligence that predicts they're going to commit a crime, when in fact, if it was allowed to play out without interference, they would never have committed the crime. That's a big danger, but our society has already gone there. We may not call it Minority Report, but we've gone there. Now let me give you an illustration. First of all, the technology that you see that exists in a nation like China and other totalitarian regimes. There's a very interesting story. I'm going to put the link up for you on paulmcguire.us. I first came across the link on Steve Quayle's website. And I'm looking on my laptop right now at a picture of this Chinese street that looks kind of like it's got red Chinese. It's a small street. It's a courtyard. It's carefully selected because it doesn't look like a ghetto. It looks like a Chinese street. And what's conspicuous about it, remember, communist China is a totalitarian government. On this one street, there are probably 30 red communist Chinese flags. Now, that's done for totalitarian reasons. It's to whip up a frenzy of patriotism. Because for crying out loud, how many communist Chinese flags do you need on a small street? You certainly don't need 30 or 40. Number two is the most dominant image of this somewhat tranquil street, of which there are only two women walking down the street. And again, I'll have the link up for you at paulmcguire.us, is that there is a very large, conspicuous pole with, the traditional camera system that's spying on everybody in the street. And the camera looks a great deal like the spy cameras they put at traffic stops, or that they use in America. It's got a pole that's kind of L-shaped, and the camera, it's a relatively large sphere with a mounting. So it's a dark black sphere with a white pole, and and there's other tiny cameras on it. It's spying on everything. Now that's just the camera you can see. And so the message is that this is in Kashgar, China. The message is they're under constant surveillance. So, you can talk about all the baloney you want to about, people being liberated, social justice, equal wealth, taking care of all your needs, the communist workers' paradise. That's all, you know what that is. I don't want to use a bad word. Those are all lies. It's the same thing in the United States of America. When you hear millennials and nutritionally deprived movie stars whose brain cells don't work because they're fried from meth make political statements, about, the utopian America that's going to come. I don't care if it's coming from the right wing, if it's coming from the Republican Party, or if it's coming from the left wing or the Democratic Party. Any political party that tells you they're going to build a paradise in America, and you're stupid enough to believe it, like the millennials. And I'm not picking on millennials, but hey, millennials, like on the list of like suckers, I'm just being direct because I'm not afraid of hurting your feelings. There's a lot of people who communicate to you that they think they're going to reach you by kissing up to you or appealing to you. Well, I was a rebel once, like you are. I was convinced I was right, but knew nothing, just like you are. I was a revolutionary, as some of you are, and I was wrong. And so, it's not like I'm confronting you in a condescending way. And I think you know that. I'm just shooting straight. I'm telling you you're stupid. And I can see people listening to me saying, "Oh, I can't believe you call people stupid." Yeah, I did. You know why? Because it works. It's effective. I have their attention. And the proof is I get tons and tons of emails from around the world where millennials and others respond because I'm telling them the truth. You see, I'm not telling them they're stupid in anger. I'm telling them they're stupid because they're uneducated. And I'm not putting myself up in a superior position to them because I'm openly admitting that I have committed all of the mistakes that they're committing. So they respond to that. They don't respond to being put on a pedestal. They don't buy that. They're dying for somebody to tell them the truth, even though they may reject it, as I did. But they're not the only ones that are stupid. Most of America is stupid. At least 50 to 60% of America is in a trance state. You know why? Because despite the fact that they were raised in a relatively free nation, they are just as sucker punched as anybody else. They think that some utopian, all-powerful government is going to solve their problems. No, that's not the way it works out historically, and it's not the way it works out now. All the governments, without exception, that claim to promise paradise, social justice, utopia, wealth redistribution, everybody gets their own home, equalize everything, regulate everything. Every single one of those governments. See, I'm not saying millennials are genetically stupid. I'm not saying they're stupid because they're mentally inferior. I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're stupid because they've been deprived of the truth because they thought their parents were sending them to an educational facility called K through 12 and all the way up through college to PhD level. And the reality is that the millennials, as well as my generation and your generation, we never did go through an educational facility. We went through a mind control factory where we were scientifically dumbed down. Our right brain was suppressed, and we were programmed from childhood not to think, not to inquire, and we were programmed with all this propaganda, these lies about the world, these lies about our nation. And it was the expectation of the elite, the globalist elite, which really do exist, that they would be able to, and they have largely been successful, subjugate or make slaves out of billions of people through this mind control / really what it was, educational process. And as Huxley said, and I quote him in my books, you know that, and the reason I have to constantly quote him is because he's one of the most powerful planners of this new world order, and he explained it so succinctly. He talked about the reality of a scientific dictatorship where you could program people through a variety of means to not recognize they were slaves in somebody else's system. And not only would they not recognize that they were slaves, but Huxley said they could be programmed to literally love their slavery. And that's what we have in all the Western nations. So it's not just communist China, it's the USA. So Why does China need to? I'm looking at this report, and it's a report of surveillance like you would not believe all over their people. So, for those of you that know people that are Marxists, socialists, progressives, communists, this is the pathway of communism, Marxism, progressivism 100% of the time. There's no deviation. If somebody who's a progressive tells you that it's an abnormality for totalitarianism and surveillance to exist in a communist country, they are programmed. They are deceived. It's not an abnormality. It's the norm. So you take a guy who appears to be bright, I'm trying to remember his name, Van Jones. Okay, he appears to be bright. He appears to be intelligent and sharp. He has a decent vocabulary. He has good debating skills. But I'm telling you, without even knowing him, that deep inside him, he's got a void. He's been programmed. There's like a blank slate. He has been programmed into some state of cognitive dissonance. That's a state of consciousness where you can hold two opposing belief systems in your mind simultaneously without experiencing conflict or tension. Now, I'll spell that out clearer. Cognitive dissonance is a mechanism in modern mind control where you can program people to hold two contradictory, opposite belief systems at the same time, and people are content in that state of irrationality. An example is that you can program people to believe that they're happy and free in China, and at the same time you can have slave labor camps, surveillance, secret police, and oppression all around you, but you're walking around with a dumb grin on your face thinking that you're in a utopia. See, your logic has to be in a state of suspended animation for you to believe that. It's called cognitive dissonance. So I'm looking at this stuff on China, and I'm saying to myself, you would have to be, and I'm going to put this up too. I'm going to get, after this show airs, or hopefully by the time the show airs, I'm going to have this video up there because this video rocks. It's a video that is supposedly a computerized surveillance video of a Chinese intersection. And the video is more than a video because it's called Sense Video, and it uses artificial intelligence and deep learning for face, body, and behavioral recognition. So you're going to see pictures of cars and people at this intersection, and then you're going to see the video screen analyze the people, analyze the cars, break it all down, and you're going to see this amazing display of artificial intelligence telling you, is this person angry? Is this person happy? It's like there's no words of describing the intensity of this surveillance system because it gets right into facial recognition, personalities, pre-crime analysis, and everything else. And the first thing I said to myself as I looked at this artificial intelligence surveillance video system, I said, you would have to be absolutely out of your mind to think that if this is already working and functional in China, you'd have to be drop dead crazy not to recognize that if China has it, every Western nation, including the United States and Britain, etc., we already have this going. And let me take it a step further. Not only do we have it going in street intersections, I can't prove any of this, by the way. So you're going to have to track with me and think with me and say, is this analysis correct? I believe it's 100% correct. I really do. But I can't prove it. Nobody can prove it. Unless you're Edward Snowden and you want to live in Moscow for the rest of your life. I can't prove it. But based on the facts and based on rational analysis, I'm convinced that my assessment is 100% accurate. We know, for example, that cell phones, our HD TV screens, are surveillance devices. If you don't know it, I guess you've been living in a cave. So whether you know it or not, all of your electronic devices, your laptop, your cell phone, your flat screen TV or whatever, whether the power is off or on is irrelevant. Remember, all these devices now have cameras built into them. And just for your remembrance, because I dealt with this earlier in my original books 20 years ago, there were cameras built into them 20 years ago. You just didn't know it. But now you know it for a fact because you use your computer technology or your flat screen TV for things like Skype and, when you talk to people on the internet and all kinds of things. So you know for sure that you have a camera light or a camera. But don't be so naive to think that your camera light, don't be so, I hate to keep using the word dumb, but I'm going to use the word dumb because I can't think of a better word. Don't be such a dummy. Don't be so naive as to think, I mean, really, man, this reminds me of the streets of New York City. This reminds me of Jackson Heights, Queens, when I grew up. And on the streets of New York, you had street sense, and you kind of had to determine who was a sucker and who was like, somebody to be contended with. Well, you would have to be a sucker to think that the camera on your cell phone, your laptop, your Samsung 50-inch flat screen TV, that the camera is only on when the camera light is on. You would have to be a sucker to think that your Skype is only recording or whatever else you're using when the camera light is on. And you'd have to be an even bigger sucker to think that just because you turn the power off on your electronic device, that it's not still on and it's not still video and audio recording. So, I mean, are we tracking together here? It doesn't matter whether your camera or TV or cell phone or laptop or whatever is off or on. It still records 24/7 audio and video. Same with your TV, same with your laptop, same with everything, okay? Forget about off and on switches, an illusion for fools. It's always on, except if you take the battery out, and even that's questionable because we don't know for sure if there's not some secondary little battery that lasts a long time. Okay? So you're under surveillance. Now, are you in particular under surveillance? No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying I'm not telling you to be paranoid. I don't think, for the most part, most of you, unless you're smuggling in some huge quantity of something or other from a South American country, I don't think you personally are under surveillance. I don't think I'm personally under surveillance. Why? Because I haven't done anything wrong. But it's all about the collection of megadata, as Edward Snowden says. So that means they record all the time in the event that if in the future you change or you commit a crime or whatever, they can go back and get all kinds of information. Number two is they're using artificial intelligence. So let's say, and you've got to go to my website, paulmcguire.us. I'm going to make sure my webmaster has this up, because then you'll understand what I mean. I'm looking at this picture of the street. The artificial intelligence in the system will zoom up on like 12 key people and tell me something about their moods and stuff through facial recognition. Okay. If you've got to remember, when I wrote a book called Who Will Rule the Future, which is one of my first books on Bible prophecy, it was written in 1991. Who Will Rule the Future? Resistance to the New World Order. I talked about my career, by the way, as a researcher, as a prophecy teacher, as a journalist, as a best-selling author, as a speaker, has been one of breaking cutting-edge information, being attacked by it, being ridiculed by it, being accused of being all kinds of things like conspiracy theorist for it. And then 5, 7, 10 years down the road, a small percentage of honest people apologize to you and say, hey, we're sorry, we thought you were out of it, but you were really right. You were the first person to speak out. Okay, I'm not asking for any bouquets of flowers for that, but that's just, when you're a watchman on the wall, a true watchman on the wall, and I'm not the only one, there are many others, and you're willing to talk about stuff that other people won't, it's just part of the game. You take the heat. So I remember telling people about a global surveillance system called Echelon in 1991. And of course, I was attacked for, making the system up. And I was challenged by those who were uneducated because they said, oh, there's no way it could possibly work. Well, the reason they didn't understand how it could work is they did not understand the basic concepts of computers and metadata. They had this conception in their mind that there's like a room with 2,000 people and computers, and they're spying on everybody through computers. That was their mental conception. That's not the way it works. How Echelon worked, and this was in 1991 when I wrote about it, Echelon worked because it had sophisticated computer systems which were able to sift through all kinds of information simultaneously, and then it would be triggered by key words. So they would simultaneously, and it was a joint operation with a bunch of nations like Great Britain and Australia and New Zealand, America and other nations, and there was echelon systems all over the world. And it sifted through every phone conversation, every fax, every kind of electronic communication back then, which compared to today was a small amount of communication. Okay? I mean, there weren't cell phones, there weren't internets, but it sifted through all electronic communication. And what it did is it was searching for keywords. I won't even repeat the keywords, but let's say bomb or something, or, words that might mean criminality, okay? And then if they saw enough of the words, and depending upon the locations of the people, then they would do deeper searches and deeper searches. And if they got more feedback that there might be something to it, they would conduct an operation against that individual or group. But it began with computers, not people, computers sifting through billions of bits of information, looking for key words that would trigger the system. That's how it works. This is the same way. So let's say you're in your living room, okay, and your HD Samsung flat screen is off. But let's say there's 3 or 4 of you sitting by a couch talking or whatever, and you don't realize you're being videotaped, audio is being recorded and scanned. Not for any particular reason, just for metadata collection. But the artificial intelligence that is part of this system notices, let's say, that all of you are very, very angry. It looks at your biometric facial recognition. It analyzes your voice tones and pitches. It analyzes your heart rate and blood pressure, all with you not knowing. It analyzes your psychological profile that you don't even know it has access to. If or any medication you've been taking, do you drink a lot of booze? Are you taking illegal drugs? All kinds of stuff it's sifting, okay? And it sees that you're very, very angry, and then through artificial intelligence, it determines there's a high propensity for violence. Okay, this is all hypothetical. All of a sudden, SWAT team goes through your front door, kicks down the door, body armor and all, and you're all spread-eagled, face down with your hands behind your head, because this is hypothetical. The artificial intelligent computer system overestimated your potential for violence, okay? Instead of reading it as, let's say, they're all very angry, but it's under control violence, the artificial intelligence that's guiding it failed to recognize that the reason you were angry, and you weren't even thinking violent thoughts, you were just very angry and blood pressure was high, was because, let's say, there was a conversation between two couples, and hypothetically, somebody cheated on somebody, and you were all meeting together, and there was great rage in the marriage because of infidelity, and it failed to recognize that one of the people in the room was a pastor and his wife trying to facilitate healing. All it did was pick up the anger levels, and it overestimated them. And maybe the wife was feeling temporarily like she wanted to kill her husband or vice versa, but it was only a flashing emotion. She would never have done it in a million years. So the artificially intelligent part of the system that is spying on you triggers an alert that there's going to be violence. It's analyzing you of a pre-crime that you would never commit because it misread the data. Now, that's an example, just one, but you could play this out a million different ways. You could end up losing employment with certain agencies because of faulty perception and analysis. You see, this is totalitarianism, where an artificially intelligent machine determines your future, your pay raises. This is how people get profiled. This is how people are dominated. This is how people, it goes on to explain in this article, by the way, and this is where Christians need to wake up. The Communist Party, okay, in China, the Communist Party controls the courts. So listen to this. Because the Communist Party controls the courts, 99.9% of the accused of committing a crime like spying or stuff are convicted. So it's like almost 100% conviction rate. Because what that tells you, it's just the trial is a formality. You were convicted of guilt. You were guilty before you even went through the trial. The trial is just a sham. And then the Communist Party in China controls it like a police state. They send people to re-education centers. I mean, it's a nightmare, a total nightmare. Here's another picture. Police everywhere. So this is a profile. Oh, and this is a winner. I'm going to put all this up for you on paulmcguire.us. There's propaganda posters everywhere, and it has the all-seeing eye. Isn't that interesting? And the propaganda posters, it's just like out of 1984, you know, freedom is slavery. It has an all-seeing eye, and then it says in giant letters, cherish ethnic unity as you cherish your own eyes. So that's like saying, that's like a Chinese type English translation. It's like programming you to accept unity between various ethnic groups. Okay, with the big I. All right, it's like brainwashing, mind control. So this is where totalitarianism leads. Now, the disturbing thing is that when the American security high-tech companies were drooling all over themselves, and this is right before the Chinese Olympics, or a year or two before the Chinese Olympics were hosted there. Big tech security surveillance companies from America went in with their mouths drooling and sold the communist Chinese government all this spying technology and surveillance state technology and DNA databases. By the way, if you're dumb enough to give your DNA away on the internet because you're looking for your family genealogy, I hate to break it to you. You just gave away one of your most precious and private possessions to a total stranger. And I'll leave it at that. Okay, so the thing is, All these American companies made a fortune selling this spy stuff to communist China. And guess what they did? After they made their billions of dollars selling dictatorship-style surveillance equipment to China, these American companies, began to lobby the American government and sell the American government the same dictatorship, totalitarian-style surveillance equipment that the communist Chinese just bought. These American companies were now selling it to the American government and state governments. So you can do the math. Our governments, state and federal, must have the same kinds of equipment. And see, the problem there is spiritual. You have these men and women in these American corporations. I would guess you have a fair amount, percentage-wise, of Christians. But of course, they see no moral conflict in selling their country down the river. Now, let's take this from another angle. In just a moment, I want to connect the dots for you. But you see, it's important for you to understand the direction that the world and the nation is going in, unless we as God's people do our part and stand in the gap. The world is it's on a trajectory towards evil because it's under the temporary god of this world, Lucifer. Unless God's people are obedient to the Lord and become salt and light, it's going to get more corrupt and more corrupt. It has to, because men and women are sinful. Now, in a moment, I'm going to explain to you some things that I think will blow your mind, set you free, empower you, and give you the real, not the fictional, the real ability to overcome this, and not only to overcome it in your own personal lives, but to overcome it on a national level. Yeah, that's right, because I think that despite the fact that our freedom dwindles, the door is still open, and we need to be faithful to walk through the door that God has given us, because he's placed us here in this nation at this time for a reason. And if he's done that, then he must have also given us the power, the anointing, and wisdom to do what we've been called to do, both on a personal level and collectively as the body of Christ. So you're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. This message needs to be sent far and wide. We have people, I just got an email the other day from a guy who listens every night in Dublin, Ireland. And I get emails like that all the time. What a blessing to hear that a guy every night is listening to the Paul McGuire Report in Dublin, Ireland. And men and women of all kinds of ages are listening all across the United States and all across the world. And the reason for that is because people like you, who are partners with this program one way or another, you're helping to spread the word, because we don't spend any money on advertising or promotion. You're helping to spread the word about the program. And because you're faithful to do that, all these people are being influenced, and they're receiving truth on a level that they've never received it before. Now, I want to say something. There is so much information being bombarded into each one of us on a daily basis, and a lot of it is propaganda and disinformation. Let's just take the Vegas shooting. You know, it is obvious that the official story is not the real story. I mean, the facts are screaming out that something else happened other than what we've been told. It's obvious that there were multiple shooters. It screams for justice, that the fact that there were 4 or 5 legitimate people, one precious young lady, and other people equally precious, who, because they dared to go on the internet and tell people there were multiple shootings, are dead. That's not coincidental. Somebody wanted them silenced. And then I read the level. Somebody did a computer analysis of all the cell phones that must have been in the area at that time and calculated at an extremely low level that at the lowest level possible, there must have been 9,000 cell phones in that general area where people had a high potential of recording stuff. 9,000 cell phones. Why? Because when people are around something like that, they record it with their cell phones. And most of those people haven't come to the public yet because they're scared. And then there was the video footage I saw the other day of this Hooters restaurant casino where nobody was supposedly killed. And one girl claims she saw somebody dressed in who knows what. They said dressed like a SWAT team member. I don't want to misconstrue that into saying it was a SWAT team person. That's how the girl described the appearance. Somebody entered the back of this Hooters restaurant casino with an automatic assault rifle, okay? And then there was no shooting, they said, except where they said it was. And I mean, ambulance after ambulance, there were like 20 ambulances parked outside of this Hooters casino, and bodies were being taken out of the restaurant into ambulances. Okay, so that implies that somebody entered the Hooters casino or whatever it is and massacred a bunch of people inside there. And those bodies, and the person who videoed it showed the side street and said there was no cars coming to deliver bodies from another area. The bodies were being pulled out of the Hooters casino. And there were shooters spotted in different hotels and just tons of inconsistencies regarding the story. So we're not being told the truth. One would like to believe, but I think it's very, very naive. One would like to believe that we're not being told the story because there's a good motive. But I'm not so convinced of that. What's being hidden? I don't know what's being hidden. Was it a full-blown terrorist attack? Was it an attack specifically against a particular demographic group of people? Was it organized in a serious way by ISIS or whatever? I mean, because what we're seeing now is reports of gunmen everywhere. And the official story is preposterous as far as I'm concerned, and I don't remotely pretend to be a logistics or forensics or police expert. But an overweight guy in his 60s holding an automatic assault rifle in one hand could have only fired 2,000 rounds of ammunition with that accuracy if he had amazing strength, knew what he was doing, and was feeding, I don't know what they call it, it's like that belt of bullets into the assault rifle so you can keep firing. And in the photographs of the hotel room, I was told that every shell would have been burning hot and burned a hole in the carpet. And not only were there a minimal amount of shells in that hotel room, there were no burnt spots where the hot shells hit the carpet. And then there's the video that I think disappeared of the pulsing lights on the 4th floor where people said there were shooters in there. I mean, that story, something is desperately wrong with that story. Now that's just one. That's like a no-brainer propaganda story. Somebody's covering something up. Then we have the very revealing photograph and video interview of President George W. Bush, President Obama, President Clinton, all palling it up like they're best buddies from life. They're all on the same team. They're all one. They're all unified. That's what all the pictures and videos say. And then in a speech related to that, George W. Bush attacks Trump viciously. He doesn't use Trump's name, but everybody knows he's attacking Trump. And then there's a picture that's in juxtaposition on Drudge of Trump. And his countenance is serious, like he means business, and he's announcing tax cuts. And so to me, it's obvious. You have the three presidents who are globalists, and that's why they get along so great, because they're all the globalists themselves or globalist puppets. They all have the same agenda. Republican, Democrat means nothing. Of course they're laughing and palling it up because they're all united. Trump is the outsider because he's the only one trying to confront globalism. And that spoke volumes to me. And then Bush Jr., I mean, if people use their rational minds, he attacks Trump, again, not by name, but it's obvious it's Trump. He attacks Trump by rebuking Trump for bringing up conspiracy theories. Well, what conspiracy theories does he mean? He means the truth. What Bush Jr. calls conspiracy theories, you and I would call truths. And let's start with the basic one. He's talking about conspiracy theories. I think he even used the word secret societies, that Trump was, bringing that up. Well, newsflash, George Bush Sr. was a member of numerous secret societies, and George Bush Jr. is a member of a secret society. The primary secret society is Skull and Bones, a Nazi occult society that came from Nazi Germany, and it's the same emblem, the skull and bones, that the Nazi SS troops in the Third Reich had on their belt buckles and their caps. So I think the public, Bush is trying to laugh it off. Well, it's not a matter of laughter; it's a matter of fact, because I've heard him say it on to Tim Russert on national TV. I've heard Bush say he was a member of Skull and Bones. That's a secret occult society. That's not conspiracy theory, that's a fact. And it's also a fact that whatever weird rituals they're into, part of it involves lying in an empty coffin and doing some weird ritual, which I won't speak about publicly, but, Trump isn't inventing conspiracy theories. These guys are involved in occult groups, secret societies. So it was just very interesting to see the juxtaposition between the two. So we're bombarded with all this information. Much of it is false. Then a lot of information about China. The head of China boasts that they're going to be the most powerful nation on planet Earth. He's basically taking Trump's Make America Great Again message, and he is applying it to make China great again. Now, but see, China has a big problem, and they're not going to admit this in the American media. China isn't going to admit it, okay? And here's the problem, and I addressed it in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016-2017, which is entirely different information than the other book, which is called simply A Prophecy of the Future of America. They're both books that are power-packed, filled with information, but it's totally different information. And in A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016-2017, I talked about the factual reality that America and the Judeo-Christian belief system of America created an intellectual environment in which more inventions, scientific discoveries, freedoms, you name it, more of that kind of thing was birthed from America than any other nation on planet Earth. Because of the biblical roots of our thinking, our belief system, our Bill of Rights, our Constitution, Americans up until recently were educated to be free thinkers, to be entrepreneurs, to be inventors, to be people who can do things, not people who have a victim mentality. And this became fertile ground for inventions and all kinds of things. Now, the reason communist totalitarian nations like Russia and China and Cuba and all the others, they have a fatal flaw. China is a very powerful nation. They have a lot of technology, But the reality is that most of the technology that China has, they did not invent themselves. They got it either illegally or semi-legally or whatever by paying off American politicians. And so they didn't invent the technology. They simply imitated it. And China itself admits that their people, now this is an admission by the highest level Chinese, okay, and it's in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016-2017. There was a business study conducted by the highest level Chinese educational governmental officials, and they determined that the average Chinese student, male or female, or individual, their brain, they were neurologically wired and to be compliant, to obey orders, to never question authority, to be subservient. In other words, they were programmed neurologically from birth to be good little communists who never questioned anything. Well, that is absolutely terrific if you want to run a dictatorship and have a bunch of slaves who can't think for themselves. But if you want to have a nation which is competitive globally, and you need millions, tens of millions of citizens, men and women, who can create, who can think for themselves, who can innovate, who can be entrepreneurs, who can start businesses, who have boldness, who can decide, who have leadership capacities. You see, America, that's part of our, until recently, it's part of our normal DNA. It's the American way of life. They're trying to break it out of us, but it still exists. That's why, and if you go read my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016-2017, I list just a sampling of all the inventions and technologies that came out of America. I mean, everything came out of America, basically. Everything, washing machines, microwaves, cars. I mean, it's dizzying. And very few things came out of any other nation, just a tiny percentage. And then when you go to the communist nations, nothing was invented there. Or I shouldn't say nothing, very few things. So the communist nations, they produced some interesting military technology, some brainwashing, mind control technology. Russia manufactures vodka. China, though they made a fortune simply assembling and building American products, but they were taught how to do that by American corporations, and they benefited by exploiting their people by paying them slave labor wages that artificially increased their cash flow and built an economic empire. But you see, whether it's Cuba or China or whatever, according to this Chinese study, their people don't know, not that they don't know how, their brains literally have been wired since childhood, programmed, so that their people are incapable of inventing, of entrepreneurship, of leadership, of creating startup companies, of having that American work ethic and all the other things that made America great. You see, when you program people, you got to understand the basics of communist Marxist thinking that they hide from you. Now, I explain this to you in my book, Mass Awakening, which you should memorize. Also in A Prophecy of the Future of America, also in A Prophecy of the Future of America 2016-2017. The brand new book is essential, Conquering the Matrix, and other books like The Day the Dollar Died. And in these books, I not only talk about this communist situation and the lack of entrepreneurship, and the fact that the communist Chinese leadership are in a desperate crisis because they've recognized they've programmed all their people to be like mindless robots, and they have to somehow quickly undo all this programming, if that's possible, and they have to start creating a new educational environment that will encourage their children and young students to think, create ideas, inventions, entrepreneurship, be risk takers, etc., which means they have to go against their basic philosophy and educate them in an entirely non-communist environment. Otherwise, they're doomed. They will never achieve greatness because there's a fundamental flaw that they don't want to admit it. But communism is built on a fundamental flaw. It's a philosophy that's against human nature, and it never works. So they have to begin to Americanize like the old-fashioned way that Americans used to think, not like how the millennials think. That's the only way their people will be entrepreneurs, become leaderships, make money, create new ideas. Their people are incapable of doing that because of the educational brainwashing that went on. See how they've caught in their own trap? Meanwhile, in America, while the communists are trying to recover the educational processes of America 30, 40 years ago, America is trying to make our educational system like China, which produces compliant, non-questioning slaves. And China has learned from their mistake, and they're trying to find out what originally made America great. The same with Russia. I mean, look at those nations. China has massive industries, but it's all about building and manufacturing American products designed, organized, engineered by Americans. Russia is a nice country, they say. I don't know. But where are the innovations? Where are the new technology? They don't exist because it's still entrenched in that communist thinking. Cuba, okay? You know, these people on the left who proclaim the virtues of leftism and socialism, they're out of their minds. Cuba, the Cuban people are very intelligent. Why? You look at all the nations in the world, okay? So you look at South Korea, you look at Japan, you look at Germany, you look at America. There's so many nations where economies have exploded into life, supercharged. You look at North Korea, the people are eating rats, they're run by a dictatorship because it's the Marxist thinking. So the reason China and Japan, Japan and all these countries that embraced Americanism and capitalism, like Germany, exploded into economic superpowers is because the people were allowed to develop the mindset of success and winning and progress. When you program people to be slaves, they can't do anything. They're crippled for life. And so the Chinese at least have recognized this, and they're trying to undo it. But they're going to, see, they got a conflict because I'm doing studies right now, and they've got spy cameras on everybody, and they're specifically attacking Christians. They're specifically attacking the Christian religion. And at the same time that they are building this surveillance state, they want to compete globally and create entrepreneurs and innovators. Well, guess what? It's Christian thinking, it's biblical thinking that makes entrepreneurs and innovators. So they're gonna, it's like driving at 100 miles an hour into a brick wall. They're headed for a collision. They are going to be forced to gut and surrender and get rid of some of their Marxist garbage and embrace capitalism and Christianity, whether they like it or not, or they won't survive economically. Now, our nation is going down the same road as China. It never works, okay? So, what's the solution here? Well, I talk about it in A Prophecy of the Future of America 2016-2017. You see, you have, to a large degree, been programmed and brainwashed. Your children more so. The younger the generation, the more intensive it is. But you have been exposed to this Marxism, politically correct, progressive, mind control brainwashing. I know what I'm talking about. I quote the sources: Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, Common Core. That's the United Nations UNESCO department, which is in charge of standardizing all global education, which means make it all Marxist, make all the people compliant, because that's what Huxley, his brother, said, Aldous Huxley said, in a truly, now you really, man, you've got to own this truth, okay? Aldous Huxley, part of the British elite, said, in a truly effective scientific dictatorship, you have to brainwash people or program people to literally love their slavery and love their servitude. And they have to be brainwashed so effectively that they don't even know that they're slaves. See, that's the purpose of Marxist brainwashing in China or Russia or whatever. And that's what Huxley and his cohorts began in the United States, especially in the 60s and the 70s with the counterculture revolution. And then they took over the educational curriculum, and there has been a steady programming of American youth to dumb them down, including adults, to suppress the right brain, which is what they do in communist countries. So people are compliant, they can't look at the big picture, they just follow orders. The problem with that is the Chinese recognize that they want to make China great again, but they can't do it with people who have robot brains. And I'm not going to beat around the bush. We have all been partially programmed to be robots, more specifically the younger generations and our children. That means they intentionally dumbed us down, and our children. Just listen to a millennial talk. They can't think. I'm not being rude. They cannot think. Oh, they can think like Alice in Wonderland and the Cheshire Cat. That's how they can think. So we were deliberately dumbed down. That's called scientific mind control. That's how you control the masses. Now, I talk about this in great detail in my book, Conquering the Matrix. I don't write these books for my entertainment. I write them to get them into the hands of people like you who I know will get this information. And you're like torchbearers. You can pass it on to key people. Because most of Christianity, they're out in la la land. And I'm serious and you're serious about obeying Jesus and occupying the land until he comes. So that's why I deal with this. Now, what I'm here to tell you is that scientific mind control works. You look at everything that's going on with the Vegas shooting. That's just one thing. But then I watch, and I had not watched it. It's with the guy who starred in the TV series, 24? What's his name? Sutherland. Kiefer Sutherland. And he plays the role of designated survivor, where he's the president of the United States. And I'm looking at this TV series, and I'm saying, gee, this is nothing like 24, because there he was heroic. So the writers, trying to be politically correct and liberal, have mutated their lead character, Kiefer Sutherland, who plays the president. They have feminized him. They've made him this confused, politically correct, borderline bumbling idiot. And the whole television show is nothing more than a propaganda vehicle for like a socialist vision for America. And they don't come right out and say it, but they're implying that this deep, dark, conspiratorial enemy that begins to emerge after the first season or something is see, they don't want to be like on the nose in identifying it, but they're alluding to the fact that it's like a right-wing, white, nationalist, pro-America, make America great again movement. So they're using the television show as an instrument of mass propaganda. And notice that in the movie, it's based on the premise that there is a powerful attack on the Capitol, like in the picture of the cover of my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America. The Capitol building is blown to bits, and there's the principle of the designated survivor. So he is the one who's appointed to be the president because everybody else dies. Now that's eerie to me because I have heard of rumors. I'm not saying it's true, but I have heard ideas float regarding Trump and who the designated survivor would be. God forbid something happens to Trump. So part of this scenario bothers me because there's a thing called predictive programming. And so the main purpose of the so-called entertainment episodic program is propaganda. And I don't have time now to identify. I could identify 25 bullet point propaganda messages that you hear repetitively in each show of Designated Survivor that actually weaken the show. But remember, one of the fundamental principles of propaganda, mind control, advertising, and persuasion is this: repetition, 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 repetition. Psychologists, experts in propaganda, advertising, mind control, persuasion, social engineering learned a long time ago that if you repeat something regularly and on a long-term basis, even though a person's conscious mind may reject the message, if it's heard repeatedly over a long period of time, and especially from many different angles or sources, it will then, just through mere repetition, bypass the conscious, rational mind and lodge itself into your subconscious, and you will find yourself, without you even realizing it, that you now believe something completely different about something than you did before. And if you haven't made a complete change in your belief system, the mere exposure to repetition will weaken your grip on an older belief system like patriotism and move you at least somewhat in the direction of globalism. So we live in an environment with the tech giants, with the mainstream media, with the entertainment industry, with film, with television, episodic TV, news, broadcast journalism, on and on and on, even in the churches. We live in an environment, again, which I call the Matrix. That's why I wrote the book, Conquering the Matrix, where we're in a womb. Okay, we're in a womb, and the womb, we're attached to an umbilical cord in this womb, and we're being fed lies constantly as we're being bathed in propaganda, lies, and manipulation, scientific mind control, advertising, coercion, suggestion, subliminal thought implantation, hypnotic words, and on and on and on. And so when you end your education, your interaction with peers, your interactions on Facebook, you added it all up. You see, not one of these things has the power to really do anything. But if you add up the sum total of all those inputs, you've got a powerful matrix that's coming against your consciousness, your beliefs, your core values. And most people, because they have weak minds to begin with, and the reason they have weak minds is because they never had a truth that they really believed in to begin with. They were always kind of like a vacuum inside. And when the communist revolutionaries in Vietnam, when the communist, not communist Chinese, the communist North Vietnamese forces captured the American prisoners of war, and they began to use modern scientific brainwashing techniques on them. They learned very quickly that the American soldiers that they captured, who did not have a pre-existing set of beliefs, in other words, those people who really didn't have a core belief system that were captured, were always very easy to brainwash and convert to communism. The soldiers that were captured, that believed in the Bible, that believed in God, that were trained in the Word of God, that knew why they were patriotic, they knew the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they were impossible to brainwash. Why? Because they had strong inner beliefs. It's when people's inner beliefs have been weakened that they're vulnerable to brainwashing. And you have to understand that historically and in the contemporary sense, brainwashing is not some harmless thing. Brainwashing is a scientific method of enslaving individuals, your loved ones, and the masses. It's modern warfare. You know, people think of warfare as guns and bullets and bombs. That's true. But the real, most powerful warfare is the battle for the hearts and souls of mankind. And it occurs with ideas and symbols and suggestions and sound bites, etc. That's why I have the burden that I have, because I recognize that God has given us a window of opportunity in the United States of America. That means he's given us a last chance before his return. And right now we are in a spiritual battle for America that is so great and so powerful that we are truly in jeopardy of losing our freedoms forever. If that happens, it means we will quickly turn into a communist-type totalitarian state, just like China and all the rest of them. All these other totalitarian states have already proven the first group they target, without exception, is Christians and Bible believers. Why? Because Christians and Bible believers have that inward set of core beliefs, and therefore they're the most dangerous to a mind control dictatorships. You understand? So, if Christians were wise, they would be the ones leading and engaged and the most committed to the spiritual battle early on, because guess what? Whether you like it or not, you're the #1 target. You always have been. That's why when the Tavistock Institute and the British intellectuals, many of them were Satanists, they socially engineered the counterculture revolution of the 60s and 70s. And they used the medium of rock and roll music because it allowed them to control masses of young people by exposing them to repetitive lyrics over and over again hypnotically, and subliminal lyrics over and over again hypnotically. And then you add the other major component of mind control, which is taking drugs like LSD. Okay, and then you break and sever the deep bonds of the traditional family unit by promoting a sexual revolution. And you have the hypnotic repetition of lyrics. Now, track with me here. Oh, and then shock is essential in brainwashing. Shock or trauma. Pain, drugs, hypnosis. This is the formula, folks. You got to understand it. It's a scientific method. Okay, so America prior to Vietnam was a very imperfect, but at least outwardly adhered to Christianity, marriage, patriotism, so on and so forth, right? That happened until the 50s. Then there was shock and trauma to the masses in America. The devastation of the Vietnam War, the body bags coming home, the loss of lives in Vietnam with no apparent meaning, demoralized a generation horribly as people were killed and suffered psychologically. And the worst thing of all is they didn't have there was no real meaning to what their sacrifice did. Then there was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, where his head was blown off on live television before the entire nation. That was a trauma and a shock that was unprecedented in America. So you have the shock and awe of Vietnam. You have the shock, trauma, and awe of JFK being assassinated. This destabilizes the inner psychological equilibrium of an entire generation. Now pay close attention because this is a scientific formula. Modern mind control is based on a scientific equation that is just as scientific as E equal mc squared. Do you understand what I'm saying? You must have pain, drugs, hypnosis, and then variations of that in order to program people. So when Einstein got on the chalkboard and wrote E equal mc squared, and other scientists wrote formulas on a blackboard, those are scientific formulas. Mind control is the product of a precise scientific formula. Pain, drugs, and hypnosis is the essential part of the formula. So let's go through the formula very quickly. Now, if you don't understand it, or you really want to really understand it, then get my book, the new book that's coming out. It's being released from the printer October 27th. Then it gets mailed in order of when you purchased it. So it's going to be around the corner. And that's Conquering the Matrix, because it really explains this in detail. Okay, so let's go through the basics. Number one, the generation of the 60s and 70s was exposed to severe traumatic shock. The horrors on television of the Vietnam War. The shock of seeing the President of the United States having his head blown to bits in a car in Texas. That was shock and trauma, big time. The Vietnam War was part of the shock and trauma, especially with the demonstrations. Okay, that produces destabilization, a lack of orientation in the inner man or woman of millions and millions of people. You now do two things simultaneously. You've established the first part of the equation, which is shock or trauma. The second, or pain. Shock, trauma, and pain are the same, because severe shock, severe trauma produces either physical pain or psychological pain. They're all part one of the formula. Now, drugs. All of a sudden, mysteriously, LSD appears everywhere across America. The CIA was involved in the promotion of LSD. People like Timothy Leary, and I document this in my book, Conquering the Matrix, and many of the major promoters of LSD, the Grateful Dead, Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey, the rock and roll groups, the Beatles, on and on and on, promoted LSD, and LSD was available. LSD at the time was the most powerful mind-altering drug ever developed. Now you must understand, why is it that the hippie generation chose to use, of all drugs, LSD? Oh yeah, they used marijuana and other drugs. I'm not saying they didn't. But LSD was the key one. Now, let's review history, and I need you to pay close attention. You can't go into a daydream state and miss this, because this is a simple formula. When we add it all up, you're going to go, wow. And you're going to understand more in 5 minutes than you probably have in your entire life regarding key questions you've always had about our world and this nation. So, all of a sudden, all across the Western nations, Britain, America, other places, LSD is everywhere. LSD just happens to be the exact same drugs that the Nazi rocket scientists and genetic scientists and the Nazi mind control scientists were using in Nazi Germany. They were occult scientists. They were brainwashing mind control scientists. They were Satanists. And the drug that they used to cause people to be brainwashed was specifically, the Nazi mind control drug of choice was LSD. Got it? After World War II, the CIA, under the orders of Rockefeller, under Operation Paperclip, brought in 10,000 Nazi mind control scientists, genetic scientists, and rocket scientists. The documentation, the stories are in my book, Conquering the Matrix, the first book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, Mass Awakening, The Day the Dollar Died, and other books. You need to read them. You need to understand what's going on. So, of all the drugs out there, LSD suddenly becomes the most popular. And it just happens to be the primary drug that the Nazi mind control scientists used under a secret project called MKULTRA, or the Manchurian Candidate operations, in which they could mind control and hijack a person's personality through the use of LSD and the other parts of the formula of mind control. And they could program people to be political assassins of presidents or whatever, and they could program them to do many things. And they used the same scientific formula for programming these MKUltra mind control assassins as they did on the mass generation of the 60s and 70s. Got it? Okay. So what they would subject the potential Manchurian Candidate assassins to was extreme pain, extreme shock, brutality that's unspeakable. Then they would dose them with massive doses of LSD, sleep deprivation, repetitive programming words, and then they would hypnotize them, and then they would use powerful electroshock therapy that was so powerful that it would create, they'd burn out their brain cells, they'd burn out their memory cells, create amnesia walls where they couldn't even remember they were programmed. But later on, 10 years down the line, if you used a trigger word like, I don't know, here comes the sun. This is hypothetical. I'm not saying it's a trigger word. Here comes the sun. So they hear it 10 years later, and all of a sudden they're out to shoot a president or do their program mission. Because the trigger word can be any hypnotic command buried beneath the surface of the conscious mind. Now, this was the Nazi rocket scientists that came to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. When we see what happened to the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, we see the exact same formula of scientific mind control not being applied to one individual like a Manchurian Candidate, but to an entire generation. So let's review once again the formula for mind control or the process. First, we have shock, trauma, or pain. We established that the assassination of Kennedy on TV, the horrors of the Vietnam War, is shock, trauma, pain. Number two, we have the introduction of the most powerful mind-altering drug in the world, LSD, which is exactly what the Nazis used to create Manchurian Candidates. LSD is distributed magically all over the U.S., okay, and the world, and Britain. So now you've put an entire generation, just like you'd put a Manchurian Candidate, into altered states of consciousness. Because it's in an altered states of consciousness, that's where you program people. So you got all these people high on LSD. They've been exposed to shock, pain, drugs, and hypnosis. And then, while they're in that disassociative, mind-blowing state of LSD, they're now exposed to repetitive, hypnotic programming messages, primarily through rock and roll music, to some degree television, film, and other mediums, but primarily rock and roll music. Why? Because in order for mind control to work, the person has to be programmed while they're in that altered state of consciousness induced by LSD, and they have to hear the same commands, hypnotic commands, over and over and over again, repetitively, both in their conscious mind and both subliminally that's layered into the audio tracks of the record. So we look at the dynamics of the rock and roll music industry. What do we see? We see millions and millions of teenagers and young adults or whatever buying the same vinyl records, which they would play over and over and over and over and over again at parties, etc., where they would be stoned on marijuana, other drugs, LSD, and those rock and roll records, whether it's the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, whoever it is, there's the constant repetition of catchy lyrics that you can hear consciously or that you hear subconsciously. And even when your mind hears these, here comes the sun, the octopus's garden, all these like weird phrases don't make any sense to the conscious mind. But when you're on acid or when you're in an altered state of consciousness, even though it makes no sense to your conscious mind, your unconscious mind understands and obeys because they're hypnotic commands that can be triggered. So, the other principle is you have to use repetition, 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 repetition of the lyrics or the command words and the records. So the lyrics are exposed to several generations by the tens of millions repetitively. Why? Because when people buy a vinyl album, they get stoned and they play it over and over and over again. Then, number two, because of the rock and roll industry, first it's AM stations, then it's FM stations. But all of these stations eventually come up with this top 10, top 20 playlist, or they come up with specific playlists controlled by the record companies. Why is that? Because there are powers higher up than the record companies who want the masses of people listening to the AM and FM radios, listening to their vinyl records. They want them to hear the lyrics, hypnotic messages, and subliminals of the same select group of artists over and over again, because that select group of artists, the top 10, the top 20, or whatever, those are the ones that have the coded messages and the hypnotics for programming. They don't want them hearing every rock and roll group under the sun, because all those rock and roll groups are not in compliance and they're not putting out the same lyrics and the same programming consciously and subliminally. So the rotation of the music in the cars, on the AM and FM radio, is standardized methodically and organized into top 10, top 20, and that's why you can go anywhere in the country, at least back then, and you would hear the same exact rock and roll groups and the same exact rock and roll songs played in a lineup in repetition, no matter what station you would hit. Why? Because you're exposing tens of millions of people to repetitive command messages on a conscious, subconscious level. Repetition, repetition, repetition is part of mind control. Now, there are many other parts of mind control, but this is why you've got to get my books and keep yourself free and your children free, because everything that I'm talking to you about in the past is happening now at this very second, but it's simply utilizing different lyrics, different customs, new technologies, but the same game is being played now as was being played then. They've just changed the outward appearance. Okay, so let's get into it a little bit deeper. At the same time, these mind control experts penetrate via Stanford University, MIT, and other think tanks, the evangelical church, and they begin to teach pastors how to teach their sermons. I talk about it in my books. You've got to read it. You've got to understand. But let's summarize something here. The primary objective of the counterculture It was a mind control assault on tens of millions of people in the United States and other nations. It was designed intentionally to target 4 principal, what they considered enemies. Actually, the list is a lot longer, but the top 4 things these social engineers, this occult Illuminati globalist elite wanted to destroy, because they're Luciferians. Wake up and hear my words. They're Luciferians. If you don't believe it, read my book, the first book, A Prophecy of the Future of America. So the lyrics, the lifestyles of the groups, the purposes of the sex, drugs, rock and roll, and the whole thing in the repetitive lyrics is to, number 1, destroy the Christian religion. Number 2, destroy Christian marriage. Number 3, destroy Christian morality. Number 4, destroy nationalism and patriotism. And that's exactly what they did. The hippie generation, counterculture, walked away with those institutions basically destroyed. The battle was won. Nobody even knew there was a battle. And it's happening right now with a different set of symbols, lyrics, and messages. So, God has given his people the power not to make the same mistake twice. God is about ready to return. God wants his people to occupy the land until he comes, not go off into strawberry fields forever. Got it? God wants a last day's soul harvest. God is love, not the counterfeit love that was programmed into a generation. Love, 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 all you need is love. The Beatles song, it means nothing. God is love, real love. And John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life." So because God is love, he wants to reach every man and woman alive with his messages of love, which is the message of salvation in Christ. But they can't hear that message if they've been brainwashed with mind control, invisible barriers. Those invisible barriers have to be removed through prayer and spiritual warfare, but also by exposing the people who are under the spell of mind control to truth in the most creative and effective way possible. That's why we're putting together our studio. That's why we're doing our live streaming. That's why we're doing our video messages. That's why I'm asking for your help in winning this important spiritual battle by contributing and making donations to our media outreach, because it's not the typical thing. It's designed to be effective. It's designed to be a game changer by the grace of the Lord. It's designed to really bring in a last day's soul harvest and change the direction of the spiritual battle of our nation. And that's why I always add this as part of the radio program. We're going to take this radio program and we're going to live stream it, but we're going to enhance it. We're going to be on all social media, but enhanced, because we have to fight in a competitive battlefield that's multidimensional. And if you have an understanding of the real dynamics of what you're up against, you can win, especially if you rely on the power of the Holy Spirit and the authority of God's Word. So, I've given you the basic framework. Now, the challenge before us, because time is running out. Bible prophecy is being fulfilled. And the weapons of mind control have become far more sophisticated than they were in the 60s or 70s. That's why I wrote Conquering the Matrix, to educate people to the technologies that are being employed that most people wouldn't even believe exist, but we prove to you they exist. Number 2 is we need to understand where we are in the prophetic timeline. Christ has not returned yet. So he's given us an opportunity to be faithful. To the degree we are faithful, that's to the degree God will be faithful to us. I'll share something personal with my life in just a second, which the Lord keeps reinstilling this message to me. And so I want to share it with you here on the Paul McGuire Report, because I believe it'll really help you. By the way, we have tons of free articles and information. We have another Paradise Mountain Church service meeting coming up quickly. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. Help us spread this message far and wide. And we'll be back in just a second. This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. And I want to just get back to where we were. In God's prophetic timetable, he has not yet returned, which means we have still been given the opportunity to preach the gospel, to make disciples of all nations, to win souls, to bring in the last days soul harvest, to occupy the land until he comes. And that means, number one is we need to rely on the authority and inerrancy of God's holy word and teach God's holy word as it is. Don't change it into a symbol or metaphor. Take it literally and as at its plain meaning, unless the text in the Bible indicates otherwise. So we believe the Word of God. We believe Bible prophecy literally. Number two is we need to recognize that the battle in our personal lives and collectively is spiritual. For the weapons of our warfare are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. And we need to recognize that our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers of darkness in heavenly places, spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. And so our warfare is beyond simply psychological material, although that's important. It involves the spiritual realm. Now, what is holding the people in captivity? They're under a spell, so to speak. What is keeping them under the spell? Well, when you have millions of young people walking around with earbuds in their own isolated world, cut off from reality, and the only thing they're hearing is music, which I guarantee you has embedded programming lyrics, they're cut off. It's like by them walking around, I know this is going to sound weird, but them walking around with earbuds, disconnected from human relationships, it's the same thing as if you were to put them in some kind of communist isolation cell or sensory deprivation chamber where they're not exposed to any human contact and they're just listening to propaganda being broadcast into their ears. Walking around with earbuds, and you may think the analogy is extreme, disconnected from reality, hearing the same messages over and over again, is a very soft and seductive version of the indoctrination programming I just described. Don't kid yourself. So they're being programmed through the media. They're being programmed through the educational system to think in a particular way. Now, how do you deprogram them? Because they're in a hypnotic state. To be blunt, they're in a hypnotic state. But if you study hypnotic states, the origin of hypnotic states always goes back to the occult, demonic activity, and ancient sorcery and ancient witchcraft. I talk about this in Mass Awakening, A Prophecy of the Future of America, and Conquering the Matrix. So, in order to break that spell, so to speak, you've got to interrupt it. You've got to put something before their eyes or before their ears that captures their imagination. You've got to back it up with heavy-duty prayer. You have to make sure you have the truth of God's word in your communication. And then you pray and you direct your message towards them where they're at, which means social media, which means television, which means music, which means broadcast, which means Facebook, which means all of the technologies. But you got to grab their attention. And then you got to present a fast message that they can relate to. Now, we have a number of projects, which I can't disclose publicly, which are very, very seriously gearing up to accomplish that objective. And I can't talk about it now, but you need to pray for it. And Lord willing, we will have some things that are very powerful to announce. Number two is, I am so thankful to each and every one of you that have heard from the Lord, and the Holy Spirit spoke to you about what to give and donate. And we've had some very unusual things happen in the last couple of weeks where the Lord has impressed supernaturally on people to give to our ministry in unexpected and unusual ways because they obeyed the Lord. And I'm sensing, because I've noticed there's been an increase of this recently, is I believe it's because God is stirring people's hearts that the hour is urgent, and they recognize that, hey, I've got to get involved. I've got to pray. I've got to take some of the money that the Lord has blessed me with, and I have to invest it in God's work, or there won't be anything left. I'm talking about the freedoms of our nation. So I recognize, I think most of you recognize, that we're in a spiritual warfare. We are in the process of developing our television studio, enhancing our social media, and vastly expanding the outreach, because we're going to go visual and live streaming of our media outreach. And we also want to do it in such a way that we will capture the attention of people that are not traditionally paying attention to the messages that we would communicate, because they're too religious or too boring. So we have an opportunity to do that now. And the doors are open, and we're moving quickly, but I need your help. And I thank God for all of you that have obeyed the Lord in these unexpected ways. You know who you are, and I thank you deeply for your faithfulness, and most of all for your obedience to the Lord. I simply ask you to go before the Lord, pray, and ask the Lord what you can do to join with us and partner with us in winning souls in an unusual way, in breaking through the deception and reaching people with truth, occupying the nation spiritually until he comes, bringing in the last days soul harvest, and winning souls by cracking through, to be blunt, like a hypnotic barrier, which is spiritual warfare. I'm asking you to go to the Lord, again, don't go to the Lord after you've talked to yourself and convinced yourself of an answer. I'm simply asking you to go to the Lord, empty, and come before him, say, Lord, show me, what do you want me to do? And wait on the Lord, and then whatever God instructs you to do, whether it's an out-of-the-box thought or not. We've got a lot of people who have responded in unusual ways. God told them to do this or that, and it was unusual, but they have significantly helped our ministry. So go before the Lord and ask him what you personally can do. And then whatever God tells you to do, obey him. And the Lord will bless you for your obedience. And, it doesn't matter whether the Lord tells you to do something that humans think is large or small. The issue is you're being obedient to whatever God has told you to do. That's the issue. And then for those of you, go before the Lord. And if you haven't become a regular prayer partner and prayer warrior for this ministry, then I ask you to ask the Lord if you need to accept that assignment. And then if he gives you that assignment, take it seriously, because we're in this together. And believe me, it is a spiritual battle. It doesn't come without a cost. I don't ask for anybody's sympathy, okay? But you can't do what I'm doing, all right, and be on the front lines without experiencing major conflicts of all kinds, all right? It's just, it goes with the territory, but that's where the Lord told me to go. And so we are going to obey the Lord. We are seeking God. And we believe that we know that God is raising up people to partner with us. And we thank you for your willingness to partner. I believe that together, even though we're a remnant, we can turn the tide of the spiritual battle. And make no mistake, we're in the fiercest spiritual battle this nation has ever seen. So unless we get involved intelligently and led by God, we could go down. I don't believe that's going to happen. I believe we can turn it around. But we have to move in consultation with the Lord and in obedience to the Lord's directives. So if you want to join with us, visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. And again, we have all kinds of free material for you at paulmcguire.us. Or just drop us an email and let us know that you're praying. Would be a great encouragement. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. And remember, Jesus is Lord and he is returning. And he's not returning as the Lamb. He's returning as the conquering Messiah, along with the armies of heaven, to establish a new heaven and a new earth. Evil will not continue to triumph. Satan's on a leash, and he's barking loudly, but he's on a leash. And God intends to defeat the usurper, and God intends to establish his rightful lordship over planet Earth and the entire created universe, because Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Until then, visit paulmcguire.us. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire.